So we will manage state. Like for now, we manage. So for now, we were managing state and data in two ways. One, we were passing properties, right? We were passing properties to components. And the second one is by using state, using the use state hook, right? So these are the two ways that we know now that components can get data or state or data or properties. So via properties and via this internal state, right? Now, today we're going to learn two more ways, right? And one of these ways is the context. So we will learn how to use the use context hook. And the second one will be I use a third-party library. Now, in this case, there is a lot of libraries that we can use. In this case, we're going to use Zustand. There are a lot of libraries that you can use to manage state, like this global state. And these libraries, basically there is a ton of them. It depends on what your organization wants to do. For some time, there was a big library called Redux that almost every other company was using. Redux, like that. So basically what happens with Redux is that with time, it was really hard to create applications or maintain applications with Redux because it was really bloated and you had to write a lot of code to manage state. And then simpler, smaller, and more efficient libraries are starting to emerge. One of these libraries is Zustand. And actually, when Redux was, I think, at the top, hooks didn't exist. So it was kind of like the natural way to do things. And then React added hooks to the library, and then Redux started losing this usability. I mean, it's still good, but I think hooks are easier. And the other thing is like smaller and simple libraries starting to emerge, like Zustand, and then I think no longer any new app is using Redux out of the gate, right? You can have apps that have Redux, old apps that you have to maintain, but I don't think any new apps will start using Redux, right? So we will not learn Redux in this program, but we will learn how to use context, and this is one of the React own ways to manage global state, and we're also going to use Zustand. And you will see Zustand. We will try to recreate that to-do application using Zustand, okay? Okay, so the first thing is the context. So a context is basically a way to store data in a global store, so that any component that wants to access that data can do it via the context, right? But that means that only the components that are wrapped by that context, right? So the context is basically a component that wraps a bunch of other components, and everything inside that context will have access to that data. So that means that if you have, let's say you have two components in the page, and in one of them you have a context, the other component doesn't have access to that context. It's only if you are inside that context that you have access. That makes sense? So let's see how we can create a context. So the first thing for creating a context is to actually create a context, and context names are created the same way we create, not created the same way, they basically have the same naming as components. So they are written in Pascal case, okay? So that's the first thing. And we use this syntax. We use, let's say we're using to-do list context. And we use the create context, we use the create context function. That create context function is inside React. So we need to import create context. So we have to do import create context from React. Okay? Now, the parameter of the create context function, and by the way, this is outside components. Okay? You don't create a context inside a component. You have to create the context outside of a component. Now, when you do create context, that parameter over there is the initial value of the context. So if you want to start with an empty context, you can put undefined. Or if you want to start with some data, then you can start with, I don't know, an empty array. Let's say this is the context for the to-do list, right? So the initial value will be an empty array. So here we create the context. By the way, you need to export your context because whenever you're using that context, you need to import it, okay? So that's it, that's the context. Now, once you're going to use, how to use the context? So for using the context, you have to first wrap your whole application or the section of your application you want with the context provider. So the context provider is something like this, to-do list context provider. And then you have a property called value, and in that property you can set the new value of the context. Okay, so any component that I put here will have access to that context. Okay. Now, in reality, how do we use this? In reality, we use this, like for example, in the context of that to-do list application. Remember that the to-do list, we have a export function to-do list, right? And inside that component, we have the state. The state was the to-dos, set to-dos. Use state, empty array. Now the value that I will set here is the to-dos. Oops, sorry. Okay? So as you can see there, everything that I put inside my to-do list application or my to-do list component will have access to that context. That means that I don't need to pass the properties directly to the components. Every component individually can get whatever property they want from the context, right? And we will see how can they do that. So for example, the components that we have were the task input and the task list, right? So to-do list only had two components, task input and task list. So we can go back and say, okay, here we have task input. Notice that I'm not passing any more properties because I don't need to pass properties directly, and task list. Yeah, here, right? Now the task list and the task inputs, the task input component, they have to get the properties that they need from the context. Now let's see the task list, right? Because that's the context that we have, to-dos. So the task list how do we get the data from the context? The way we get the data from the context is using a hook called use context. So there is a hook that we need to import as well. And we can do this. To-dos equals use context. And then we pass as a parameter the context that we want to access. And remember, this context name is to-do list context. So we have to pass here to-do list context. And of course, that to-dos is essentially the value, right? So here I can just render, well, to render this we use a map, right? I think, well, you know how to use a map. I will not write the whole map here. But now we have access to the data from the context. And the thing is that every time the context changes, that component gets the new data and re-renders itself again, right? Make sense? Now, you can store anything on the context. You can store data, but you can also store handlers, right? So right now, our context is only storing an array of to-dos. But we can store something more complex in that. We can store, let's say, an array of to-dos. Oops, sorry. We can store an array of to-dos. I'm using an object now. We can store the task, right? And then we can store a handler to set to-dos. And this function is undefined, because remember, this is the initial value. We don't know yet how this function will look like. And then we will have a set task. I don't really care about these two functions. Actually, I can just ignore them. But this is the initial state of my to-dos, of my context. And then here I can improve this. Let me change it a little bit to make it task, set task, use a state. So I'm creating another state for the input, right? Remember that. Now, instead of passing just the to-dos, I will pass an object, and that object will have to-dos, will have tasks, will have set to-dos, and set tasks, right? I'm passing all those properties in an object inside. By the way, this is let me just make a remark here. Remember, when you're creating an object, right? When you're writing an object, and you're passing an object, let's say the property name is to-dos, right? The regular syntax of an object is to put quotes, to-dos, colon, and then the value, correct? So this is how we create an object. Now, what happens is that if the key is a valid variable name, I can simplify that as this. Okay? I don't need to put quotes when the key is a valid variable name. Remember that? That means that if I have an object that has a key like this, and that's perfectly that's correct, but I cannot write it like this, because that to-do list is not a valid variable name. Remember that? So that's the first optimization that we make. We don't put the quotes when the key is a valid variable name. Now, the other optimization with objects is that if you have a variable called to-dos, right, and you want to create an object that has a key to-dos, well, first of all, you don't put the quotes, so you put to-dos. But if the key matches the variable so instead of doing this, right, you can actually put to-dos, and it's the same. Make sense? So you can simplify the object. That's what I'm doing here. I don't want to write. Oops, sorry. I don't want to write to-dos, task, right? So the full form of this will be to-dos, comma, task, colon, task, because it's task the key equals task the variable, and then to-dos keys equals to-dos the variable, and the same for set to-dos. Set to-dos equals set to-dos the variable, and then set task equals set task the variable, right? This object can be simplified by just putting to-dos, task, set to-dos, set task, right? That's what I've simplified. But that's what we do with objects, right? We simplify removing the quotes, and then if the key matches the variable that you are going to assign, then you don't need to put you put just one. Okay? Cool. Just in case it's not clear. So here, well, I can leave it there like that, but it should be Okay, these two are the same. Now, that means that I'm passing, in the context, I'm passing to-dos, tasks, a handler for set to-dos, or the function that allows me to change the to-dos, and a function that allows me to change the task, right? So that means that because I'm passing an object, in my task or my component that is acting in that context, I can extract them using the same method, right? Well, in this case, it's set to dos. Because I'm not extracting just if I want to extract the whole context, I can get the whole context, but then from the context, I can get the to-dos, right? Now, these two lines can be simplified by just destructuring the to-dos directly here. So I don't need to get the whole thing and then extract the property that I want. I can just extract the properties that I want directly, right? So that's what we're doing here. Now, in this function task list, I'm only needing the to-dos. But what about for example, the task input? Task input will get the task and the set task from the context. Okay? And then it's returning, I think it's using an input here, right? Well, you get the rest. Yeah. So that's how context works, right? Now, what happens when you put a component? Let's say I create this component that is taken from the context, but in my to-dos, I don't put this context. And what happens is we'll return undefined, and it will fail, right? Because when you're trying to access that context doesn't exist, and the component will not get the data, right? The other thing is that what happens when you nest several contexts, the same context, multiple times? When your component tries to access the context, it's getting the closest one. Okay, so if you have a set of components, like, let me show you. So you have a component, you say you have a context like this, and then some other component has the same context, and some other component has another context. And here you have a component that is trying to access that type of context. It will get the one closest to it, right? So this component will have access to the closest context. But if you are over here, then you will have access to the one outside, right? Because you don't have access to the one inside. Hopefully that makes sense. It's the closest one from my parents, not from my siblings, right? The context is up, right? So that's what context is. It's basically a way to store data at a higher level, right? Now, what is the possible drawback that you see here? Using
like context.
Sorry?
To have the context encapsulated, you don't have the access.
Exactly. So the problem with context is that you have to encapsulate the thing, right? So if you don't put the context, it will not work, and that might be an issue, right? So then, because your components, they will have to be inside that context for them to work, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but
So
that's the purpose of it.
That's the purpose, yeah, but the thing is that it will force you to put a context on top. If you don't put a context, I mean, when you're thinking about this, it's like, okay, yeah, but that's the purpose, right? I put the context, and then every component inside have access to that context, right? That makes sense. But the thing is that you might not need to do that, right? There is other ways that we will see how to manage that, and it doesn't force you to create a context. Sometimes sometimes it's the only way to do it, because some libraries, and we will see some libraries that actually require you to put some type of context, And this is common, for example, for authentication, right? There is a lot of components that are created around authentication, and they basically say, okay, take this context and put it on your root of your app. That means that everything inside your app will have access to the authentication, right? Make sense? So that means that any component, like you have a component that's showing your avatar, that component doesn't have to get properties to show who's logging in that session. It would just get it from the context because everything is wrapped in the authentication context, right? Or if a component needs access to certain database or certain backend resources, there will be a database or a backend resource context that is the one handling that connection to the backend, and your component only needs to get something from the context and just making the query necessary, right? Your component doesn't care about how the connection is made. Your component is only caring about, I need that resource, and I'm getting it from the context, right? And that's it. So that's what context is. It's basically a way to have a global state, global store of data. It's not, remember, it's not just data. You can have also functions there, right? So you can have functions, for example, in these to-dos, I can have functions to change the to-dos, and actually I can have more functions. Like, remember we have a function here to actually to delete tasks, and we have another function to add a task. So I can add all the functionality here, right? But then I will have to create them, right? Add tasks. Oops. Well, whatever this function means, and the same for delete task. I can pass it to the context, and anybody can get it from the context. Make sense? Questions about context? So let me explain. So context is there, and it's good for you to know it, because sometimes we need to use it. The thing is, like, it's not rare, the instance that you actually need to create a context. We will see other ways that we can handle this global state. And so it's not uncommon, but it's it's not frequent when you have to create a context, right? And we will see next why. And it's because we have libraries like, and by the way, there is one more thing here that I think you should learn, and it's that usually this use context, to-do list context. You see here that you need two imports, right? One for the use context from React, because that's a React function. And the other thing is that you need the to-do list context. So in reality, this component here will need at least two imports. One for use context, right? Because we need to import that. And the other one for my to-do list context from whatever that context is created, whatever module that context is created. Now, that's kind of like a lot, even if it's two. So one thing that we haven't discussed yet in React is that you can create your own hooks, right? You can create your own hooks, and those are called custom hooks, right? But of course, they all start with use. So use whatever you want, right? And for example, if I want to create a hook for my context, I will do it like this. Well, I need to export it because everybody needs to import it. I will do use to-do list, and this will basically be a function that uses the context to-do list context. I mean, I can simplify like this, right? But I want you to see where is this coming from. It's because if I'm using the context, I want the whole context, right? And then I will return that context. Now, Now, do I need the variable context?
No.
No, right? I can just put return here. That will be the same. But remember, if you have an arrow function, and the arrow function is just returning something, you don't even need the return. So you can just put in the same line. Right, that's why I'm simplifying it like this. But it's actually calling the context and returning the full context to whatever it's calling. So now instead of using my context like this, I can just do use to do list. And that's it.
Oh, okay.
Right? So use to do list. Internally, this is using the context, but it's custom, right? So it's what I say is like the name has a meaning. And actually, you want to make it a little more, you can call it like this, use to-do list context. So now you know it's a custom hook that is giving you access to that context. Okay? Because this is technically a context. So you just want to. Got it? Questions about custom hooks? We will see custom hooks later. Because the thing is that with custom hook is that you can give better names to behaviors. So when you're using a set of hooks too much, you can put those hooks in a custom hook, and you can just call that custom hook, and that custom hook is doing everything, right? So you don't have to have the same code in every component. You can just have a custom hook that does the whole thing, and you just get the custom hook, right? It's a way to encapsulate all the behavior. Okay, now that's what context will give us, and again, it's pretty cool. We will try to minimize its use, right? In reality, we will try to minimize its use. The same way we try to minimize the use of user-fed, right? Remember user-fed from last class? It's not that we cannot use it because it's actually there in the library, right? If it's there, then that means that it has a purpose. It's just that the effects might be somehow tricky to use, and somehow it can lead to infinite renders. So we will try to minimize the use of user-fed and context. Okay, cool. Now let's find another way to actually create state and make it in a way that we can reuse it and make it simple to create this new application, right? And for that, we're going to use this little library here called Zustand. Now, this library is pretty small. It's actually, well, by the way, we need to import it, of course. But the way we use it, you have to install it. The name is Zustand. Of course, you're going to go to your template or your project, and just do npm install. And let's see how can we use it. So for example, for the to-do list, Zustand is going to allow you to create a custom hook. And that custom hook, that custom hook let's say we're going to create the use to-do list, right? Now that use to-do list, that the Zustand library has a single function called create, right? And that create function, the parameter for that function is another function that will have two. Actually, set get, sorry. Let me see if I'm correct. Yes, set get. So this is an arrow function. Yes? So create, the parameter of create is a single function that receives two parameters, a set function and a get function. And whatever whatever this setGet function returns, that will be the state of my application. And let me explain this. So the state of application is comprised of two things. One is the data, and the other thing are the actions. Let me explain a little bit of that. And in your lesson, you will see that reflected as flux. And let's talk about flux for a second. Zustand is like a mini implementation of flux. The same way that Redux, back in the day, was like the de facto implementation of flux. And actually, the person that created Redux is today the React maintainer, right? So he was not part of the React team at Meta, but he's really good, and the Facebook team just hired him to run React. I don't think he ran it. I think he's the main maintainer. Of course, there's a big team there, right? But he kind of like, not sure if invented or implemented the best alternative to this. So let's see what flux is. And you probably seen in the description in your lesson that flux is something like this. You have right? So you have data, renders, and action. Okay, so remember, React basically takes anything that is data and renders a version of that, right? This is known. So whatever properties we're getting in the component, we're rendering that. And every time the data changes, every time the property changes, we render again, right? So this is the flow here. Every time the data changes, the component gets re-rendered, okay? Every time the state changes, component gets re-rendered. Every time the context changes, component gets re-rendered, okay? Now, what happens when you re-render is that the app gets in a state when it's basically waiting for user interaction, right? The user might click a button, something might happen in the back end. There's several things that can happen, right? But those are actions, right? So what happens is that the only way to trigger that data change is via an action, right? So what I'm saying is that nothing should be able to change the data directly, but an action, right? So what we're doing basically is, let me see if I can put what we're doing is the only way that data is going to be changed is via an action. And an action is just a function that does something on the data. The point of this is that we always know how the information flows. It only flows in a single direction. You see? Data is modified, component gets rendered. When the component is rendered, the only thing that it can happen is an action. And then when that action is called, right, then the data changes, and then the component gets re-rendered, and then another action can be called, right? So it's a single flow. And that's what they call flux. Okay? Now, there's a lot of implementations of this concept, right? There was I remember a library called Alt. There was a library called Redux. There, Atom, Zustand. There's a bunch of them, right? A lot of them. Zustand, the point with Zustand is that it's really simple. And you will see that we can create a to-do list app super quick, super easy, and then we can use it super easy as well in our application. And the nice thing about it is that everything gets encapsulated in a single page. So when you want to know how a certain logic works, there is only one file that you have to go. And in that file is everything, right? So let's see how can we create that to-do app. So this is the syntax for creating a Zustand store, right? We're creating this use to-do list, and it's a function called create, and that function gets a single parameter, and that parameter is a function with two parameters, set and get, right? Now, yeah, pretty much. Now, the first thing that we put in this object, by the way, the first thing that we return in this object is the data, right? So in our case, is the to-dos, it's an empty array, and the task. And the task is an empty string, right? So we put all our data. And then we put all of our actions, right? The actions are the functions that modify that data, right? So what are the actions that we can do in a to-do application, right? Add task. When we add the task, that's an action, right? So we do add task, or add a to-do, sorry. What are the parameters for this function? So when I'm adding a to-do, what do I need? The task, right? I need the task. And actually I can say, okay, don't even need the task because we already have a task here, right? We don't technically need the task. So let's do it like that. And we use the set function. And we can say, okay, task will be now empty, and to-dos will be state.todos and task and state.task. And that's my add task. Now that set function, this set function is basically taking the state, the current state of the store, and with the current state of the store is saying, okay, the new state of the store, so I'm going from state to state. The new state will be, the task will be empty because I don't need that thing should be clear. Remember that we're clearing that part. And then the to-dos array will be all the state to-dos that we have so far and a new one. Make sense? Kind of? So that's the add to-do. If I want to do delete to-do, I need to pass an index, right? Index. So what is going to be the function here? I need to pass a state.
We don't need the task, right?
Sorry?
We don't need the task there.
No, we don't need the task here. So I only need to.
So all
To do.
now you have to delete the task from the array.
Exactly, for using the index that I'm getting, right? So to-dos will be the state to-dos filter. Remember the filter? I not index. I think, yeah. And that's the delete. Oh, sorry. And I think that's it. I don't need anything else from the state. That's my whole state, right? I only adding task and deleting task. Let's see if we can understand this code. Actually, you see that I don't need the get. It's pretty uncommon to need the get. Let me keep the get and rephrase this function here. So with the get, you can do this. I need to know the to-dos and the task. And I can get it from get. Right? So get is a function that when you're calling it, it will give you the state of the store. It will get you the state, right? It will get you an object with all the data, including the to-dos, the tasks. So I'm only getting the to-dos and the task. And then for the set, there is a variant of the set that is simpler, like this. You can say, okay, the task will be empty, and then to-dos will be to-dos and the task. I think this version is kind of cleaner, right? And then for the delete, I will get all the to-dos from the get, and then I will say set to-dos is to-dos.filter like this. Questions about the two functions? You see how the functions work? And the main thing here are the set and the get function. Get will get me all the data from the store or for the state, right? The state, remember, is everything. It's the to-dos and it's the task. So I'm getting to-dos and tasks. And then I'm setting the new state as task will be empty and to-dos will be all the existing to-dos plus the new task, right? So that will be the new state every time I call this function, add to do. And if I call delete to do, I need to pass an index. I think using it will make sense. So when I'm using this in a component, if I'm using this in a component, let's say to-dos, or let's call it T, use to-do list, right? I can do this. I can say task. Oh, by the way, I'm missing one function here, and it's the add task, or set task, or change task, actually. And it takes a task. Okay. So I can change the input, right? I need to be able to change the input. Now, when I'm using that to-do hook, I can do change task and call, I don't know, buy groceries. When I do this, so first of all, when I create my hook, the first time, what is the value of to-dos and what is the value of task?
So to-do is an empty array and task is an empty
An empty string, because that's what the initial value of them right there, right? That's the initial value. So at this point, if I do t.todos, that will be what? An empty array. And if I do t.task, that will be an empty string. Now, if I want to change the task, I call the function, the action, right? Because the only way to change the data is to call a function that will modify that data. There's no other way. That's what a flux store means. So change task by groceries. So after I call this change task function, what will be the value of task?
empty.
Buy groceries, because I just call a function called change task, and this is the function that I'm executing. This function is taking the task that I'm passing, buy groceries, and it's setting the store with that value of task, right? Now, if I call add to do, what happens? This function gets called, the one that says add to do. Notice that this function doesn't need parameters, right? It doesn't need parameters. I'm just calling add to do. And then this function is doing this, is getting everything from the store. What is the value of to-dos right now?
Empty array.
Empty array. What is the value of task?
Buy groceries.
Buy groceries. And it's setting the data, the store is setting the store as task will be empty, and to-dos will be all the elements of the array that is empty, and then the task. So it will effectively add that task to my to-dos, right? So right here, after this, my to-dos will be buy groceries, and task will be empty, right? To-dos have an element. If I do t.delete to-do, and I pass 0, what will happen? I will call this function over here, and this function is getting all the elements of that store. And right now it has one element, it's the buy groceries, and it will set the new to-dos list as all the elements but the one that I'm trying to delete, right? So effectively deleting that element because I'm passing the index 0. So notice that with this simple, well, not that simple, but with this, I mean, you're seeing it for the first time. Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
But this whole this whole to-do list, right, encapsulates a to-do list, right? What that means is that I can take this code and I can put it in a mobile application and just provide the visuals for a reminder app in your phone, and will still work the same way as if I take this code and I put it in a web application and has a to-do using Bootstrap, right? The logic behind those to-dos will be the same because it's the same hook, right? The logic is right there. Everything that I need to manage in terms of logic is in a single place. Let's say tomorrow I want to, you know what, let's add a backend. So when we modify the data, the backend is always synchronized. I don't have to go too many places in my app trying to add a backend. I can go to the hook that has the whole to-do list and just say, okay, let's add one more function here called sync. I'm just making this up now, of course. But I will add another function here called sync backend or sync DB, or let's call it backend. And this function will, well, this will be an async sync function, and this function will do some magic, and we'll see the magic on Wednesday. But this function will basically take the data that I have in the to-do. So the first, I can give you the first line. And the first line will give me the to-dos, right, from the get. And send it to the backend. That's it. I just have to call that function and the backend will be synchronized, right? And if I want to do it automatically, I can do, well, every time you do every time you change, like after I set I can, you know, send it back. Actually, there's another way to do it. It's a lot nicer. But yeah, we can see that. So that's what I'm saying, is that there is another way. Now, when we're using this hook, I don't need to be in a context anymore, right? I can call this hook, I can use this use to-do list anywhere in my applications without using a context.
But do we have to pass it through the components?
No.
Oh,
This is the way, exactly, because you can just say, use the to-do list, and it's that to-do list. It's a single to-do list, right? It's only one. It's like in computer terms, this is what we call a singleton. A singleton is an object that there is only one in the app, right? And this is a singleton by default. There's a ways to create more than one to-do list, but it's kind of, I mean, it's not complicated, but you don't need to do that, right? You only have a to-do list in your app, and you're just saying, give me the to-do list, and that's the to-do list, right? So yeah, that's the way I want you to create that to-do list. So what we're going to do, and I can share this with you, but what we're going to do is to replicate, right, the to-do list app that we have from last Wednesday, but adding Zustand to that project, and then creating the hook, and I will share the hook with you so we can see how that hook works, and then you will change all the props that we're passing and just using the data from the hook, okay? So let me share this hook with you, and I will share it in a minute, and that's the purpose of today's class, is to create a version of that to-do list app, but using Zustand, okay? So let me stop here.